They laughed when they saw a single cowboy ride into the valley, because behind those fires stood an entire Apache camp. One man against hundreds. No backup. No escape. Everyone thought he would die before sunrise. But what happened next turned the battlefield into a nightmare nobody expected. By the time the smoke cleared, the camp was drenched in blood, and the lone rider had written one of the most unbelievable survival stories ever told. The question is, how did one cowboy survive against impossible odds? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible Wild West adventures. So, without wasting any more time, let's dive straight into the story. The dying sun painted the desert in shades of red and gold as a lone rider moved slowly across the endless wasteland. Dust clung to his worn coat, and his horse struggled with every step. The man in the saddle looked half dead himself. A deep cut above his eye had dried into a dark stain across his face, and his left arm was wrapped tightly with a blood-soaked bandage. For 3 days he had barely slept. For 2 days he had eaten almost nothing. But stopping was not an option. His name was Jack Mercer, and he had been following a trail that most men would have abandoned long ago. Weeks earlier, a ranch near the Arizona frontier had been attacked. More than 50 cattle had vanished, and several families living nearby had disappeared without a trace. The sheriff called it a lost cause, but Jack had made a promise to the terrified ranch owner. He would find out what had happened, no matter the cost. The tracks had led him across dry riverbeds, rocky hills, and endless stretches of burning desert. Twice he had fought off bandits who wanted his horse and supplies. One bullet had grazed his shoulder, and another had killed his spare horse. Yet the trail continued west, and so did he. As the evening wind swept across the sand, something caught his attention. Smoke. Not one column, but many. Jack guided his exhausted horse toward a rocky ridge and climbed the rest of the way on foot. Every movement sent pain through his body, but he forced himself onward. Reaching the top, he dropped to one knee and stared into the valley below. His blood turned cold. Hundreds of campfires flickered in the darkness. Tents stretched across the valley floor. Horses were tied near the streams. Warriors moved between the fires while guards patrolled the outer edges of the camp. It was far larger than he had imagined. There had to be hundreds of people down there. Then he saw something else. Near the center of the camp stood several wagons surrounded by armed men. Shapes moved inside crude wooden cages. Even from this distance, Jack knew what he was seeing. Prisoners. The missing settlers were still alive. For a moment, he closed his eyes. Any sane man would ride away and return with soldiers. But the nearest fort was 2 days east. By then, the prisoners would likely be gone forever. If he turned back now, every mile he had traveled, every wound he had suffered, and every promise he had made would mean nothing. He checked his supplies. 1 rifle. 2 revolvers. 31 bullets. That was all. Not enough for a battle against hundreds. His horse snorted nervously as distant voices echoed from the valley. The darkness grew deeper, and the campfires below seemed endless, like stars scattered across the earth. Jack knew the truth. Riding into that valley would probably kill him. But leaving meant abandoning innocent people to their fate. Slowly, he loaded his rifle and spun the chambers of his revolvers. Then he climbed back into the saddle and fixed his eyes on the sea of campfires below. Alone, wounded, and hopelessly outnumbered, the lone cowboy turned his horse toward the enemy camp and rode into the darkness, fully aware that he might never see another sunrise. The moon hung high above the valley as Jack Mercer guided his horse through the rocks and dry brush surrounding the camp. Every sound seemed louder in the silence of the night. The distant crackling of fires, the restless movements of horses, and the low voices drifting through the darkness reminded him that hundreds of eyes and rifles lay below. One mistake would end everything. He left his horse hidden among a cluster of boulders and continued on foot. Each careful step sent pain shooting through his wounded shoulder, but he ignored it. He had come too far to stop now. From the shadows above the valley, Jack studied the camp. Warriors moved between rows of lodges while children and women gathered around fires. Horses were tied near the stream that cut across the camp, and armed guards watched every approach. Near the center stood the wagons he had seen from the ridge. Beside them were rough cages made from logs and wagon parts. He narrowed his eyes. There they were. Several frightened settlers huddled together inside. Men, women, and even 2 children. Their faces looked thin and exhausted, but they were alive. One elderly man sat against the bars with his head lowered. A young woman held a crying child close to her chest. Jack felt his jaw tighten. If he rode away now, they would never survive. He watched the guards carefully, counting their movements and searching for weaknesses. There were too many. For stood near the prisoners alone, while others patrolled the camp in pairs. A direct attack would be suicide. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind him. Jack spun around. A shadow stood barely 20 feet away. One of the scouts had spotted him. The warrior reached for his knife, but Jack moved first. He lunged forward and tackled the man to the ground. They struggled silently in the dirt. The scout tried to shout, but Jack covered his mouth and drove his knife downward. The fight ended as quickly as it had begun. Jack stepped back, breathing heavily. His heart pounded. If another patrol found the body, the entire camp would be searching for him within minutes. He dragged the dead scout behind some rocks and wiped the blood from his knife. Time had run out. There would be no waiting until dawn. He needed confusion. His eyes drifted toward the horse lines near the stream. An idea formed. Keeping low, he moved through the shadows until he reached the edge of the camp. He untied several horses and slapped them hard. Startled, the animals bolted through the darkness. Others followed. Within seconds, dozens of horses were racing wildly between the fires. Shouts erupted everywhere. Men rushed to stop the stampede. Dogs barked. Women screamed. The guards near the prisoners turned their heads toward the chaos. Jack slipped closer. But before he reached the cages, a voice suddenly shouted. One of the warriors had spotted movement in the darkness. A rifle fired. The bullet smashed into the dirt inches from Jack's feet. Instantly, the camp exploded with noise. Warriors grabbed weapons and rushed from every direction. More gunshots shattered the night as men searched for the intruder. Jack threw himself behind a wagon and fired back. One attacker fell. Another bullet tore through the wood beside his head. Now the entire camp was awake. Voices echoed everywhere. Some believed a large attack force had arrived. Others fired blindly into the darkness. Smoke and confusion spread across the valley. But hidden behind the wagon, loading another round into his rifle, Jack Mercer knew the terrifying truth. There was no army. No backup. No reinforcements. The chaos consuming the camp had been unleashed by one wounded cowboy. And now every warrior in the valley was coming for him. Gunfire erupted across the valley as chaos swallowed the camp. Men shouted orders that disappeared beneath the thunder of rifles and the screams of terrified horses. Smoke drifted through the night while shadows ran in every direction. Many of the warriors believed they were under attack by a large force. None of them imagined that one wounded cowboy hiding behind a wagon had started it all. Jack Mercer fired again. Another warrior fell. A bullet smashed through the side of the wagon, showering him with splinters. He rolled into the darkness just as 3 more shots ripped through the place where he had been lying seconds earlier. Everywhere he looked, armed men were rushing toward him. He ducked behind a pile of barrels and quickly reloaded his rifle. His shoulder burned with pain, and blood had begun soaking through the bandage around his arm again. He ignored it. Survival came first. A group of warriors appeared through the smoke. Jack fired once. One dropped instantly. The others scattered, shooting wildly into the darkness. He ran between 2 tents and disappeared into the confusion before they could surround him. The entire camp had become a battlefield. Horses crashed through fires, kicking over supplies and sending sparks into the air. Panicked animals raced between tents, adding even more confusion. Women and children rushed for safety while armed men shouted to organize defenses. Jack used every shadow and obstacle he could find. He fired from one position, then quickly moved to another before anyone could pinpoint him. A stack of crates became his shield for a few moments before bullets tore through the wood. Then he slipped behind a water wagon and disappeared again. But the warriors were adapting. They realized the attack was coming from only a few places. Their numbers began closing in. Arrows suddenly flew from the darkness. One sliced across Jack's cheek. Another buried itself into a post inches from his chest. He fired toward the flashes of movement and ran again. As he reached the center of the camp, he heard voices. The prisoners. Still trapped. 2 guards stood beside the cages. Jack raised his revolver. 2 quick shots echoed. Both men dropped. "Get down!" he shouted. The terrified settlers pressed themselves against the bars. An elderly man stared in disbelief. "It's you," he whispered. Jack ignored him and searched for the lock. Before he could break it, more gunfire exploded behind him. 3 warriors had spotted him. A bullet struck his side. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. He fell against the cage, barely staying on his feet. Pain shot through his body. Blood soaked through his shirt. But he forced himself upright and fired back. 1 attacker collapsed. The other 2 disappeared into the smoke. Jack grabbed his rifle and smashed the lock with the butt. The cage swung open. "Move!" he shouted. The prisoners stumbled out, frightened and weak. A mother clutched her little daughter while 2 injured men struggled to stand. Another child cried as gunfire echoed around them. Then someone shouted from across the camp. More voices answered. Torches appeared everywhere. And suddenly Jack realized something terrible. The warriors had finally understood the truth. There was no army, no soldiers, no attack force. 1 man, just 1 man. Their confusion vanished. Their anger exploded. Dozens of armed warriors began closing in from every direction. Jack checked his revolvers. Only 6 bullets remained. His rifle held 4 rounds. 10 shots. 10 chances. And between him and escape stood an entire camp hungry for revenge. As flames rose into the night and shadows surrounded them from every side, Jack slowly cocked his rifle and stepped in front of the terrified settlers. Because if they wanted the prisoners back, they would have to kill him first. Jack Mercer stood between the terrified settlers and the warriors closing in from every direction. Flames from overturned campfires cast long shadows across the valley while angry voices echoed through the night. There was no more confusion. No more hiding. Everyone in the camp knew exactly who had caused the chaos. 1 wounded cowboy. And now they wanted his blood. Jack raised his rifle and fired. A warrior charging through the smoke fell instantly. "Move!" he shouted to the settlers. The frightened group followed him through the burning camp. 2 injured men supported the elderly prisoner while the young mother carried her little girl. Every second counted. Bullets and arrows flew around them. Jack fired again. 9 shots left. They reached the stream that cut through the valley, but more warriors appeared ahead. Trapped. Jack grabbed a lantern hanging from a broken wagon and threw it into a pile of supply crates. The oil exploded into flames. Within moments, fire spread through blankets, barrels, and wooden wagons. Horses panicked again, breaking loose and racing wildly across the camp. Thick smoke covered the valley. Screams erupted everywhere. The warriors hesitated. Jack used the confusion. "Run!" he shouted. The settlers followed him toward the northern edge of the valley. Behind them, half the camp seemed to be burning. But their escape had not gone unnoticed. War cries echoed through the darkness. Dozens of riders mounted their horses and began the chase. Jack glanced behind him and cursed. They were coming fast. Ahead lay a narrow canyon surrounded by steep rock walls. It was dangerous, but it was their only chance. "Keep moving!" he yelled. The group stumbled into the canyon while gunfire cracked behind them. A bullet struck one of the rescued men. He collapsed onto the rocks. Another settler stopped to help him. "We can't leave him." Jack knew stopping meant death. But he couldn't abandon them. He turned and fired his rifle. 1 rider tumbled from his horse. 8 bullets left. The settlers dragged the wounded man deeper into the canyon while Jack covered them. Riders entered the narrow passage, but the rocks forced them into a tight formation. That worked in Jack's favor. He fired again. Another rider fell. The others pulled back. For a moment. Then arrows rained into the canyon. 1 struck the wall beside Jack. Another sliced across his leg. He staggered but stayed upright. Blood covered his clothes now. His breathing had become heavy. His vision blurred for a moment, but he forced himself to focus. The settlers reached a bend in the canyon and stopped. The wounded man could barely breathe. The child was crying. Everyone looked at Jack. Fear filled their eyes. "Go," he ordered. "But what about you?" the young woman asked. Jack glanced behind him. Torches were appearing at the entrance. More and more. There had to be dozens of them. He checked his weapons. 8 bullets. That was all. If the warriors broke through, the settlers would never escape. He looked back at the frightened faces. "Keep going," he said quietly. "No matter what happens, don't stop." The elderly man shook his head. "You'll die." Jack gave a tired smile. "Maybe." Then he stepped back toward the entrance of the canyon. The settlers watched in silence. 1 wounded cowboy. 8 bullets. Against an entire army of angry warriors. The first riders appeared through the smoke. Jack cocked his rifle. Behind him, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten. Dawn was coming. And as dozens of enemies gathered outside the canyon for one final attack, Jack Mercer prepared for the last stand of his life. The first light of dawn crept across the mountains as Jack Mercer stood alone at the mouth of the canyon. Blood covered his shirt. His left leg trembled from exhaustion, and every breath sent pain through his wounded side. Behind him, the rescued settlers disappeared deeper into the rocks, praying that the man who had saved them could somehow hold back the warriors gathering outside. Torches flickered in the darkness. Dozens of riders waited beyond the smoke. They had stopped their attacks during the night, but now the confusion was gone. The camp behind them still burned, and anger filled every face. They wanted revenge. Jack checked his rifle. 8 bullets. That was all he had left. He smiled bitterly. 8 bullets against an army. The first riders charged. Jack fired. 1 horse collapsed, throwing its rider onto the rocks. He fired again. Another man fell. The narrow entrance forced the attackers into a bottleneck, preventing them from surrounding him. Still, they kept coming. Bullets smashed into the canyon walls. Dust exploded around him. Jack ducked behind a boulder and fired once more. 6 bullets. A warrior tumbled from his saddle. The others pulled back. Silence settled over the canyon. Jack knew they were planning something. Then arrows filled the air. One buried itself in the rocks beside him. Another pierced his hat and carried it away. A third struck his arm. Jack groaned in pain but snapped the shaft and kept fighting. He refused to fall. Minutes later, voices rose outside the canyon. More riders. More rifles. They were preparing for one final charge. Jack leaned against the rock and slowly closed his eyes. He had done all he could. The settlers had escaped. That was enough. He loaded another round and stepped into the open. The riders came screaming toward him. He fired. 5 bullets. Another rider fell. 4 bullets. 3. 2. The charging warriors closed the distance. Jack reached for his revolver. Then suddenly, boom! A cannon blast echoed across the valley. The riders froze. Another explosion thundered through the mountains. Then came the sound Jack never expected to hear. Bugles. Soldiers. The cavalry. Riders in blue uniforms appeared on the distant ridge, followed by dozens more. Their rifles opened fire, and panic spread among the attackers. The warriors broke formation. Some fled toward the burning camp. Others disappeared into the hills. Within minutes, the battle was over. Jack lowered his revolver. He tried to take one more step. Instead, his legs gave out beneath him. The world faded. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself inside a military tent. His body was wrapped in bandages. A doctor sat nearby. "You should be dead," the old man muttered. Jack managed a weak smile. Still breathing. Outside the tent, he heard voices. The rescued settlers. The young mother. The elderly man. Even the little girl. They had survived. Days later, the story spread across the frontier. People refused to believe it. One cowboy against an entire camp? Impossible. Some called it a lie. Others called it a miracle. Soldiers who arrived that morning told of burned wagons, fallen riders, and the wreckage of a battle that looked as if an army had fought there. Yet only one man had stood in the canyon. Months later, ranchers, travelers, and lawmen still spoke of the mysterious rider who refused to abandon innocent people. Some claimed he had killed 20 men. Others swore the number was much higher. Jack Mercer never corrected them. He never sought fame. As soon as his wounds healed, he mounted his horse and disappeared into the frontier once again. But long after his tracks vanished into the desert, people still gathered around campfires and whispered about the bloody night when one lone cowboy rode into certain death, faced impossible odds, and became a legend that would never be forgotten.